Here is Sailor Delaware, a magenta ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a very, or rather, pink-leaning magenta, but still a magenta. Now, I will say that I don't really care much for this ink. However, there is some tone variation by pen, but it's not too wildly different from one to the other, and it does tend to give decent shading most of the time. As a general, I'm going to say yes. Magentas, I don't think always shade especially well, especially if they're pink leaning, as I remember it, but not bad. On non-fountain pen friendly paper though, the performance definitely went down and had a lot to be desired. Now this is a sheening ink that only sheens really on the best paper with a wet pen, so you can avoid sheen if you want to. And since I don't really care for sheen, this is a real positive for me.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get, and boy does it really show off that pink. Now here it becomes mostly pink with a little bit of magenta lane. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, and that's where we see the magenta really come through. If you look at remnant on the first line, mostly pink, the T becomes a nice magenta. That underneath it, the first T and the A are a nice pink, where the H and T darken up quite a bit and become magenta again. So I think it's looking very good if this was a pink ink. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, definitely a magenta. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades some a little bit. Most noticeably here with the Clairfontaine paper, I do get sheen occurring, and the sheen when it's occurring is a nice golden sheen. I think it looks very nice on the page. If you like sheen, I think it's a good way to go. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. Take a look at Grim on the second line, where the G is fairly light, the R goes to a nice mid-tone, lightening up a little bit with that I again, and the M at the end very dark. Now sheen comes through occasionally in the darker areas of the writing, like on the first line of the, which are fairly dark, both do have sheen. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium nib. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It's got a few moments of shading that if you really want to be going for them, I mean, they're there. Spoken on the third line, the bottom of that P gets quite dark when it hits the F of fourth. The N at the end does get quite a bit darker. There's no sheen that's going on here. It's a lot of pink with a magenta lean. It's right in that it could be pink, it could be magenta. We see enough of both of them that it's not clearly defined here on which it is. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Very much a pink with some magenta. It does not feather and it does not spread. I said it's with some magenta. It does shade, though not as well as it did with the Clairfontaine. Not that that's really a surprise. I think this is a very interesting looking pink on this, And if you are out writing and using it, you might get a few looks and have to explain to them, hey, pink is a man's color, leave me alone. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, does not sheen. Simply there, simply a very nice magenta on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, has a couple moments you can spot of the shading, like on more with the first line. The E at the end does become a little bit darker, just like the Y on any with the second line. Sheen doesn't come through, and not really a surprise. I don't think this is looking great for this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade fairly decently, really. If you look at any, when that Y comes down, it gets dark, and it got dark before crossing, so it was getting darker there. Of also on the first line, starts lighter on the O, gets much darker on the F, and of course, there's no sheen here. It's the paper, not the ink in this case. Looking at the page underneath, I circled the one dot that it did come through touching the page underneath, and when you see it from the medium nib, you're kind of not surprised with how deep the ink got into that paper. On a majority, I don't think this was too bad. I think you could use the broad with no issue. The wet fine did better than the medium did, surprisingly, and the soft fine, yeah, you could easily write back here without a problem if you were using a drier pen.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was with the Clairfontaine, showing this is a little bit more translucent in ink as it's being affected some by the tone of the paper. Now it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, perhaps even a little bit better. Take a look at North on the second line, where the N starts a little bit lighter. It in the downstroke gets darker. Lighter again on the OR, and the TH at the end, darker. Now, of course, there's still no sheen. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, it does not sheen. It does look like a very dark, rich red, though, and it is a beautiful dark, rich red. I'm gonna say this is a real win if this is the color you want and this is the paper you use. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it doesn't shade, it doesn't show the pink coming through the way the Clairfontaine did, which elevates in those ways what's going on, but it's still just not for me. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's a tiny bit of feathering that is going on. When you look on the left side of the page, back now, both the little feathers. Cried Thorin, but you're saying that's the left side of the page. Well, have little on the second line, both also feather. It's generally around there just a little bit. It does look like there's a tiny bit of spread when I'm looking at it side by side with the Clairfontaine, but it's not the kind of spread that I think you'll notice if you weren't looking at it side by side. Shading, who cares? It's feathering and it's spreading, and while I'm saying it's not a big deal, it's not a common occurrence on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. I do think even with the lighter tone that we're getting, it stands out on the quad rule without any kind of a problem, which makes it a good ink to be able to use if you are note taking or you just really like quad rule. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have some tone variation, not huge within the word, but if you look at mistaken on the first line compared to given most directly underneath it on the second line, given most is quite a bit lighter in tone. Now it does shade a little bit in words. You go directly underneath that to profits where the P is a bit darker than the RO, and it's that F that becomes much darker. During the bottom loop of the F, it lightens up into the I, but the TS at the end, very dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. Yes, it shades the same as it did on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it is still standing out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. It's doing it a bit better because we're getting a darker tone, and I think that's very nice here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little bit lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really, the Clairfontaine showed a ton of the pink, so is this. It's looking much more like a pink with occasional shading bits towards magenta, really not making it my favorite for what's going on since we should be seeing a magenta ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Noodler's Black Swan Australian Rose.
Here is Organic Studios Unicorn Blood.
Here is Private Reserve Claret. Here is Sailor Granat.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. A real wow in this case, because normally this paper makes it flatter, duller, lighter. But I think what's coming through is very nice, really outspoken and well done if you're a student using this. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. You're not going to get the sheen here, don't even worry about that. But it looks great, and I think this is an amazing ink for a student to use on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It has little bits of shading. If you look at So Now They on the third line, the So Now is quite a bit lighter than They next to it, and Began right after that goes to a nice mid-tone. Now you don't see a lot of shading within the words, but individual words do tend to come out as different tones with each other. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. I don't see shading here. It seems like really the spot you get it was that soft fine. That was such a great combination with this paper. This one, it's just kind of there, and it's not that it lacks wow, it just feels ho-hum about it. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium by a little bit, a little lighter, flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine, which is really what we expect to happen from this paper. There is a little bit of feathering that we see with still on the first line or worked on the second line, even tidings on the third line. So there's some feathering that's going on, rare to deal with in this paper. There's no spread, there's moments of shading. I'm just really hung up on the fact that there is some feathering on paper that I don't get feathering very often on. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Califolio Byzance.
Here is Kaweco Stormy Gray.
Here is Califolio Horidori.
Here is Sailor Manyo Chigaya.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, but not by a ton, but still darker. Sure, it feathers, sure, it spreads. It does have some shading that comes through, which is a rather nice thing. You know, you don't tend to expect that to happen on the 20-pound toilet paper, but occasionally it does. I think it's doing well here. With that, it's usable considering the paper. I wouldn't call this horrible. I think this is a great alternative to red for those teachers out there grading papers. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it doesn't shade. It's not what I would want to use. The feathering and the spread to me are a little bit distracting what's here. Now this is a user's choice. I think probably people that don't look at fountain pen ink aren't going to think too much of what they're seeing, but I wouldn't use it. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather rather consistently. It does spread also rather consistently. It doesn't shade. Now, the feathering is consistent, but for some reason, I think it looks better here than it did with the wet fine, but I can spot some spots here where the feathering just starting to get out of control. The color I think is great for on this paper. For again, go grade papers with this. This is not a red. It's not a color they're going to be used to seeing. Maybe people pay a little more attention to corrections. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather less than it did with the medium or the wet fine. It does spread less than it did with the medium or the wet fine. It doesn't shade. It's very pink in what's coming across. I think this or the soft fine, that dry fine pen, is really the best choice to go with on this paper, because in both of those, I think it's looking its best. Looking at the back of the page, you can see it gets deep into the paper quite frequently. Even with the soft fine, though, the soft fine, I think you could potentially write on the back of the page. The others, I don't think you could without, destroying both sides of your notes. But nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is the lightest and does shade, doesn't sheen. The wet fine, being the darkest, shades the least and sheens the most. The medium was just a bit lighter than the wet fine. It did shade the best and with occasional sheen. Now the broad fell between the wet fine and the medium as far as the tone, and this shaded the least and almost no sheen. Now I don't get the option too often to not have sheen on a sheening ink, and by using a dry fine pen you can enjoy this ink and see it in some of its nice forms. So even though it's a bit more of a pink lean at that point, not magenta, that's probably what I go for. This is a trade to me, and I'll make that to avoid the sheen that I just don't like with a dry fine pen. But if you love the sheen and you want the magenta, I'd prefer the magenta. But if you love that sheen, go for that wet fine. You're gonna get lots of it.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.